Good morning. I'm Alexander Evans. I'm a professor in practice in public policy at the LSE and also a visiting senior fellow at LSE Ideas. And I'm delighted to be chairing this panel on the state of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. And we've got a stellar panel who are going to present, and they're going to speak each for around about 15 minutes. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion up here on the panel and then really open it up so that we can have a more interactive discussion in the room. So that's how we propose to go forward. And I'm going to invite Professor, I hope I don't garble the pronunciation here. This is a danger of having an Englishman to chair anything. But Professor Przemysław Tacik is going to be our first speaker. And welcome. I'll just get your slides up.
Hello, thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be actually the first speaker at this conference. It's a little bit intimidating, isn't it? But when I was thinking about what I could bring to this forum, I was thinking about the perspective of a critical legal scholar that I am. And I would like to give you a number of ideas that I believe might give us some food for thought and that we'll be able to discuss later. So, without further ado, let me proceed to these ideas. Could you change this slide? Thank you. When I was looking at the program, I believe that the kind of a doxa of our meeting would be that there is liberal democracy which is under assault from the outside. I assumed, and I believe to a certain degree at least, I'm correct, that we are tempted to believe that liberal democracy is a kind of a stronghold which tries to defend itself against the outside enemies. And the usual attackers, assaulters, are Russia and populist governments, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, which is the region in which these forms of government have reached their maturity and some level of self-awareness. But still, I believe that this perspective might be a little bit redefined, and I will try to demonstrate in which respect we can take a parallel view on what is happening. So, first of all, I believe that the front doesn't necessarily go between the liberal democracy of the broadly understood West and Russia and populists and all these kind of villains. But it rather goes through the heart of democratic societies as well. And of course, this is, I believe, not a contentious claim, as in many European countries, you will find a number of structurally similar movements that are trying to grasp power. So in this sense, this is a front that runs through our countries. But I believe that the situation is even more interesting. And in this, I would recall the Hannah Arendt's recognition from the origins of totalitarianism. That, I believe you are familiar with this argument, that what was specific for Nazi Germany was that it confounded internal and external matters. The issues of external policies, such as foreign affairs, were treated as internal matters, as matters of the police, as matters of the administration. And I believe that to a certain degree, we can find an analogous situation right now, in which external fronts coincide with internal ones. That's why, in a sense, the clash between the defenders of democracy and the proponents of populism is something that replicates the external front that goes through Europe. And now I'm going to add a little bit of stir to this picture from a perspective of a critical legal scholar. That I would like to say that liberal democracy is, to a certain degree, in itself based on a kind of authoritarian core, which was recently revealed. And this core has a name, and I will try to convince you that exceptionality is a good term for it. Therefore, the title of my presentation is Exceptionality, Democracy and the Rise of Exceptionality, I will try to show you that even liberal democracies right now are not free from the sovereign-centered approach in which the rule of the exception allows of special emergency measures. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. First of all, let me account for why I'm using this term. We are quite familiar with the term state of exception, not only as a legal term, but as a theoretical term developed by Carl Schmitt and George Agamben. Especially in Agamben's thought, the state of exception is, of course, a legal device that we might trigger. Usually, we can find it in constitutions, we can find it in sub-constitutional statutory laws, but it's a kind of a normative instrument that might be used in certain situations. But it might also be a factual situation, not necessarily something that we declare publicly, but a kind of an exceptional situation in which the usual applicability of the law is suspended. That's what exception in Schmitt and Agamben's approach is. We suspend the normal applicability of the law, we suspend normalcy in the name of combating emergency. And here we come to the core of the problem, namely, while we fight these external threats, we invoke necessity. And whenever we invoke necessity, state of exception, exception, and exceptionality comes to play. So I propose the term exceptionality as a somewhat broader term than the state of exception itself, as a term which tries to grasp all the instances of suspension of the normal applicability of the law beyond the state of exception as such, as a normal legal device. Okay, could we jump further? Thank you. So exceptionality, by exceptionality I will understand the forms of relation between the political and the legal, which are based on the structure between universality and the exception. Exceptionality might be anchored in actual legal devices, such as the state of exception, but not necessarily. And as I will show you in a second with my empirical examples, this is precisely what has been happening for quite a long time in Europe recently. So in this perspective, the state of exception would be just an attempt to stabilize, just an attempt to normalize exceptionality within the legal system, but exceptionality is something that goes beyond it and is a kind of a remnant of the political within the legal. Liberal democracy is often based on the ideal of the rule of law and depoliticization of the basic structures of the state through law. But as critical legal studies would show us, this attempt always at the last moment will fail, leaving some remnants of the political within the legal, which cannot be eradicated from liberal legality. And this is precisely what exceptionality is about. So while thinking about how we defend democracy, we cannot be oblivious to the fact that it's very easy to invoke necessity or emergency, and in this way to evacuate the sense and meaning from liberal democracy as such. Could we jump to the next? Yeah. So I have two empirical examples for that. The first one is pandemic exceptionality. And of course, I believe it's well advised for me to make a caveat at the beginning. I'm not any kind of skeptic about this COVID-19 or any kind of anti-vaxxer. I'm just looking at it from the legal point of view. So if we look how the states in the world dealt with COVID-19, of course, medical emergency was invoked in all these countries. But to our surprise, the usual constitutional measures that would be applicable in such a situation, such as states of exception, states of calamity, states of emergency, usually weren't triggered, even in the most liberal democracies or the ones that have the opinion of being such as Germany, for example. So generally speaking, half of the states in the world have declared some form of the state of exception, but generally speaking, constitutional states of exception were not declared. The pandemic was targeted and addressed at the level of statutory and substatutory measures, often with a violation of constitutional liberties. And as far as we can still recall 2020 and 2021, the extent to which these measures interfered with civic liberties was very high. Still, it wasn't done within the limits of constitutionalism. And of course, many lawyers back at the time were saying that, well, this is a bad precedent. If we have a medical emergency, let's try to use the proper measures that we've got, such as the state of exception declared in the Constitution, and let's not try to address them at the statutory levels. Because what we get as a result is some form of creeping exceptionality. We have legal systems that are based on exceptionality, but at the outer level, let's say ideological level, they pretend that nothing has happened. They pretend that no kind of structural reshufflement to liberal legality has been done. And what we've witnessed, just as in the interwar period, is the revelation of the primacy of the executive. Carl Schmitt was recognizing that before the Second World War, that the executive is taking more and more power. And of course, I have too little time to discuss how many states were trying to combine the role of the executive with the role of the legislative. It wasn't, of course, that obvious as my general claims would suggest. And in many countries, parliaments were able, at least to a certain extent, to defend themselves. But the general trend, if we can generalize in this way, was that the executive was on the rise, that it got more power. And this is precisely this link that Schmitt already recognized in the interwar period, that the more exceptionality we have within the legal system, the more executive we've got. The second example, could we jump to the next slide? Thank you. The next example is populist exceptionality. And of course, having very little time to do that, I will just say briefly that what developed in Hungary since 2010 and in Poland since 2015 are some very strange hybrid forms of government, which are not necessarily illiberal, as Mr. Orban would like to believe, but they are rather trying to mix liberal and illiberal elements. That's why they're hybrid. This is a kind of a Frankensteinian form of existence. And they are often based on exceptionality, on taking political action against the constitution or against the spirit of the laws, with the primacy of the executive and with the argument of the centrality of the sovereign. The examples of such exceptionality is the violation of hierarchy of norms, rendering general norms factually particular, and targeted legislation. This is precisely this is very much visible in the case of Hungary, in which we've got a lot of general norms which are in fact targeted often at individuals, but they are presented as general norms. From the legal point of view, this is precisely exceptionality. Instead of providing some kind of a true general rule, we have a very particular rule applicable to one situation or a limited number of situations or limited number of addressees, which is shrouded by the cloak of generality. So, interestingly, if we analyze the pandemic from the point of view of critical legal studies, we will see that there weren't that many differences between liberal democracies and illiberal ones in terms of addressing the pandemic. So it's not that a number of liberal states might have clear conscience when compared with populist forms of government. And the last slide. Thank you very much. To conclude, I would like to say that, to reiterate that exceptionality is what links democratic, semi-democratic, and non-democratic governments. So while discussing the threats for democracy, we shouldn't look at the threats as something that only comes from the outside, but as something which is precisely inscribed at the heart of liberal democracies. And there's always this risk of this authoritarian core based on exceptionality of coming back to play. And of course, the more external threats we have, the more arguments for necessity and triggering some forms of exceptionality we have. There is a term that has been used since at least 70 years, quite a paradoxical term, authoritarian liberalism. This is precisely what we risk as well. So to sum up, I would just like to repeat that while discussing democracy, let's try to think what we can lose while defending ourselves, and that self-defense is not always a harmless process for the one who defends herself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think there's something here, is there not, about when exceptions become norms, or become the normal. I suggest we go on, and then we'll have a discussion thereafter. So, Professor Joanna Dyduch, there you are. Welcome. The floor is yours, and I'll just get your...
I also have a presentation, so if you can help me with that. Challenges too. Thank you very much. So I just start. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for invitation. I'm absolutely honored and privileged to share some of my ideas regarding the challenges to liberal international order, to liberal democracy, and the challenges to freedom, or the world where that is that is ruled or is driven by norms rather than by power or by force. As the point, next slide, please. The point of departure for my presentation are two are conclusions, are two studies and conclusions from those studies, which I had a chance to be engaged in with colleagues. And one was on changes which occurred due to pandemic on the energy markets, and specifically in reference to the ability of efficient implementation of UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the second study was on challenge that the populists in government perform to Europeanization and European integration. I owe you like a word of explanation. I'm a political scientist, I'm a European studies scholar, so my views in both of the articles were coming from this point, or from this ground. So I was very much interested on policy, or on political consequences, policy responses, and potential scenarios for the future. In the time of crisis, or in the time of consecutive crises. And if we assume that crisis would be a kind of a driver, or even a variable, I would say, that is shaping these illiberal tendencies, we may want to, please, let's move to the next slide. We may want to first think, what is this desired order we would like to preserve, or we would like to struggle for? So in the literature, there is a term, known and well-defined term, liberal international order. And mostly this liberal international order is based on, as well as structures based on rules, and it refers to certain norms, but mostly and first and foremost to the freedom of economic freedom, but also civic freedoms. It is based in operational terms on cooperation and consensus-seeking culture. Let's put it like this, and the relations between the between the actors must be based on respect for these fundamental freedoms. So it must be based on also precisely defined in the literature term political liberalism. So next slide, please. So what actually has been happening in recent years? I think we will all agree that past, I believe, more than decade, since at least 2009 or 2008, we speak about crisis. So after some years of stability, prosperity, and development of liberal values, let's say 90s, maybe beginning of 2000s, we enter in the era of crisis or crises, consecutive crises. And since we're supposed to focus here mainly on contemporary challenges, contemporary or nowadays challenges, I would say that there are still, to a great extent, what I wanted to say, or what I want to say, is corresponding with what Przemysław already said. So let us see how COVID pandemic and then war in Ukraine impacted this international liberal order. So, and the paper I've mentioned first, the table that you can see on the board, we tracked, or we defined two alternative scenarios. The scenario for the scenario that is following this liberal path, and the scenario that is some kind of opposition that can be seen as an opposition to this liberal path. And of course, the first scenario is very much based on the logic of multilateralism or effective multilateralism. It refers to well-established, agreed, and respected, and what is of course very important, legitimized international regulation, international norms, international law. It is operationalized by the international organizations, legitimized, functioning, and functional, one would say. Functional in the sense that they really are successful in fulfilling the objectives they were designed to implement. The second scenario is the alternative scenario. Is a scenario where we have a growing contestation of multilateral order, of multilateral institution. Their legitimacy is decreasing. Their ability, operational ability to act is also decreasing. They're becoming less and less efficient actor, and their actorness is questioned as well. The international norms are not respected, and since the institutions are less and less efficient and their actorness is questioned, there is no one actually that really can efficiently fight for the rules, which are a core element of the multilateral order. And this, of course, increases the unilateral nature of the international system, and the way how the international politics is being operationalized is more and more pragmatic, but pragmatic from the perspective of individual players, rather than it is not oriented to fulfill or to meet the global, communal, shared interests, but rather particular interests. So please let's move to the next slide. So since the panel we were invited to has been so in the title of the panel, this regional dimension has been emphasized really strongly, and we should look at the European, Central Eastern Europe, or the European dimension of the changes, of the challenges to liberal democracy, or to look at the illiberal tendencies. This is also something that I try to do. And in the literature or in the academic discussion, but also in, let's say, public discussion, the illiberal tendencies in Europe are very often connected or linked with populist tendencies. I must here, I don't want to elaborate on it because of the time limitations, but I have a little problem with the term populism. However, let's move it to let's leave it to as an open question. What we definitely see in the past years, let's move to the next slide, that the Europeanization as a certain process and also a phenomenon, which is an outcome, ongoing process, dynamic, but which is an outcome of European integration, is contested, is questioned. There are number of tendencies that can be seen as a certain de-Europeanization dynamics. And in order to, in the second study I mentioned, which I conducted with a colleague from Vienna, we try to conceptualize this de-Europeanization dynamics. This de-Europeanization dynamics, which in the logic of today's presentation is some kind of very specific, empiric and very concrete example of questioning the multilateral liberal order. So let us move to the next slide. Briefly and quickly, I try to observe what happens with the time. So I hope that I'm still on the safe side. And a few more minutes, really almost to conclude. Europeanization, a very popular concept that's supposed to explain changes fueled, driven by the process of European integration, has been conceptualized in a very advanced way, and scholars identify different dimensions of Europeanization. So Europeanization as a multidimensional process actually managed or was designed in a way that was infiltrating, penetrating both the international shared European space, but also the domestic space or the European Union member states in a very profound, in a very substantial way. And the Europeanization process, which has changing the way of, which was strengthening actually this European political actorness, was driven by different mechanisms. One was, of course, learning, socialization, or adaptation. All of this changed or enable to create a European policy, a European joint stand on global issues. In my first case, I referred to the energy issue, to the environmental issue. In the second case, we may, of course, refer to the responses to, let's say, political crises, and definitely war, Russian aggression on Ukraine is a political serious crisis. So Europeanization was a factor that enabled creation, establishing, and then also promotion, implementation of European joint stance. Let us move to the next slide. But what we observed recently are different tendencies, different dynamics of the Europeanization. And we categorize with Patrick 4 different dynamics of the Europeanization. One is, let me just start not in the order you can see on the board, but the circumvention. This is something that may not harm the European foreign and security policy, but may simply weaken it. May not harm, but may weaken it. This is a situation when member states prefer they try to rely on some alternative frameworks, as for instance NATO, or to empower their stance within the European Union by regional cooperation, like the Visegrad cooperation could be a good example. At the same time, they dedicate less time, staff, and resources to particular European foreign policy matters. So they are becoming less engaged. Therefore, the European foreign policy is becoming less powerful and is losing its capacities. The second de-Europeanization dynamic we identify is disengagement. It's very similar to circumvention, and disengagement. Disengagement is a situation when the member states they don't see that the European priorities are their priorities. They prefer to behave like a passive bystander. Mr. Ratu actually mentioned a situation that portrays this case. French or Italians would say this is not our war. We do not need to suffer for that. But this makes the European Union common stance on something much weaker, and of course, in a sense, also contested. The most critical de-Europeanization dynamics is renationalization and resistance. Renationalization is a situation that through the narratives, but also organizational reforms, the already Europeanized policy in the member states is becoming more and more nationalized. It happens through the changes in legal changes. It may happen also by replacement of socialized in European terms bureaucrats, diplomats by a loyalist or by those who are seen as patriotic enough. By the way, I just admit, I see that I'm running out of time. We have, of course, empirical evidences that this kind of the Europeanization dynamics would occur both in Poland and in Hungary. I speak about Poland and Hungary because we carried empirical studies in these two countries. So probably these dynamics would occur also in other states. And the final one is renationalization. Renationalization is a situation when member states would clearly reject to follow the EU objectives, both in normative terms but also operational terms. They would act differently and differently that the common position would expect them to act. Just to conclude the sentence, we can say that de-Europeanization, which is in its different dynamics, which may overlap, definitely undermine the importance of the multilateralism. De-Europeanization, if, as the empirical studies proves, very often go hand in hand with populism. If it's so, it may also affect the liberal nature of democracy. Or if I know that there are scholars who are even asking if Hungary at the moment is democracy. If it is a liberal democracy, but there are also scholars who are asking if this is still democracy. Let me remain silent on Poland at this stage, at this moment. Probably we're really in transitional period, and many question marks are to be answered. So this is a true challenge. And to final sentence, this is not only a true challenge for the domestic or the condition of the domestic political system and the democracy itself, but it's a true challenge for Europe, for integrated Europe, and for its power to be efficient, simply. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think a really interesting compliment there in terms of, if we heard in the first paper about the challenges of exceptionalism, we're now hearing, if you like, the challenges to not just the liberal international order or whatever variant of language you like around that, but this de-Europeanization trend and some of the challenges to that you were mentioning. Let's move on to our third speaker. We got Professor Raluca Alexandrescu. I hope I've done that right. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I have also a little PowerPoint. Okay, so yes, that's it. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure, and I will try to stick also to the time. I will pick up, in fact, from where my colleagues left it, in fact, because I am trying to show today some points about not only the attacks that democracy is, in fact, under, but also about the illnesses within democracy. We can maybe move to the... Okay, thank you. So, I am proposing you today some working concepts about democracy and how it's unfolding in these years. From two main working theories or concepts, which are in fact related. They are talking about similar things: democratic recession. I put here some bibliographical references also, or the theory of backsliding, focusing on three causal mechanisms: the effects of the polarization, rulers' control of the legislature, and the incremental nature of abuses of power. And in fact, the events unfolding and accelerating during the past 10 to 15 years have brought in the theory of democracy a reconsideration of the specific methods of analyzing the history of political thought and how long-term developments can bring, if not a substantial clarification, at least a clarification of how certain contemporary phenomena can be explained. So that's why an entire tradition of conceptual and cultural history argues by the nature of the methods in favor of this approach. A second direction of analysis, complementary one, is that of a regaining ground of that view concerning the theory of democracy as part of the melodies of democracy in themselves. As Professor Diamond writes in his recent Ill Winds, there is something about democracy that it's not only its power, but also its frailty. And this is a main concern. Also, by applying these methods, we can also notice that mutual demonization in public and political discourse is one of the first palpable symptoms of the ills of democracy, which an obvious predilection toward nationalism, identity emphasis, the exclusive and the absolute claim of a monopoly of patriotism, of a discursive and institutional structure that can only be controlled and managed by a certain political party, and which progressively leads to the confiscation of identity references and their diversion for electoral purposes. If we can move to... Okay, so I'm in fact trying to reflect upon this problem of democracy also by taking into account a view which I put there by Bruno Latour. Despite appearances, it is not the attitudes that matter in politics, but the form and the weight of the world to which these attitudes have the function of reacting. So the context is also very important, and that's why we are here today, in fact. to emphasize context. My main working question is in fact focused to 3 points. And 3 points that are in fact the need for transparency and the opacity and corruption of the state institutions. This is one of the main things that are of concern today. 2, claiming the future through a battle for the past, weaponizing history against democracy, which the Romanian public, not only the Romanian public, but the Romanian public is well, unfortunately, accustomed to. I stumbled upon just yesterday I put a link later if we have the time during the discussion, but I stumbled upon a video posted on the official website of the National History Museum in Bucharest, was in fact celebrating its 50th anniversary by showing us, without any context or disclaimer, a film put together 50 years ago. And well, I will maybe show you, even if it's in Romanian, it's sad to see these types of things without a context in our ears. Okay, so the third point is that we have a sovereignty problem. A sovereignty problem which is in fact incremental in the Romanian political regime after the fall of the communism, and I think also in other Central and East European countries, which in fact is one of the main problems in defining the political regime in our days. And I think we will have later in today's works or tomorrow's works and discussions some constitutionalists who will also talk about this. Maybe we can switch. Okay, so my working questions to lighten a little bit my 3 points that I just exposed. Is democracy part of the referential of normality? I mean, is democracy the normality? Second working question. Is it still useful, plausible, and admissible from a theoretical perspective to look at democracy as the mandatory end of humanity's political venture in the last half of the last millennium even? Because we can see that democracy is in fact a very recent form of government and not a very stable one, unfortunately. I should say, because we all love democracy, but, well, it's hard to stick to it. And third working question, is historicism an illness in democracy practices? That's, in fact, quite a paradox, because if we are thinking about the foundation of theory of democracy in the last 50 years, we all learned that historicism and teleological views are in fact the opposite of the theory of democracy. But what we had witnessed in the last 30 years, Leon Hartwell was anticipating a little bit this issue, is that at the fall of the communism, we witnessed a fall into historicism from some theory of democracy scholars even. It's a common thing in nowadays that at the fall of the communism, we heard some of the proeminent scholars, Ivy League scholars, École des Hautes Études scholars, who proclaimed the end of history and the repressible march of democracy to its victory. And we all, in some way, fall for it. Well, I should say in a more light view that the Song of the Scorpions at the beginning of the 90s, maybe we all remember the Wind of Change, were a little more cautious than the scholars, the Ivy League scholars and the École des Hautes Études scholars, because there was a wind, not a certainty of the change. So these are some caveats that should, in fact, preoccupy us a little bit more, and they are, in fact, preoccupying us. Democratic historicism is one of the most formidable internal enemies of democracy, according also to some more recent writings. I could bring into the discussion some of them. For instance, Tsvetan Todorov's Les Amis Intimes de la Démocratie, alongside with other, of course, authors who are in fact talking in a very Tocquevillian spirit about the enemies, the internal enemies of democracy, which are corruption, kleptocracy, which is the direct consequences of it, oligarchy in some ways, technocracy without any respect for representative forms, social and economic increasing inequalities, which is a very important thing, and it's in fact making troubles all around, even the more established democracies. Especially now with the pandemic, we all see that an increasing increasing forms of inequality. And of course, modern slavery placed under the false argument of the defense of individual freedom also. Let's in fact, leave people decide for their lives, but in fact, they are not deciding for it. They are just enslaved. Just to maybe switch to the other slide and trying to keep time under control also. I will maybe leave the floor open for any other question that I can't answer in the time of 15 minutes. Okay, so the first point that I announced a little bit earlier, I would suggest the main problem, the main talking point in the need of transparency and the opacity and corruption of the state institutions. For the Romanian model, which I know better, there is a problem in the way that modernity took its place even in the 19th and early 20th century. So we have here a question about how modernity was in fact put into place by a process of westernization, but also by a process of absorbing also some of the anti-modernity issues, as the westernization itself became a little bit a political religion and not a form of institutional practice. And there is a problem with it, because every time we are transforming institutional practices and political concepts into political religion, the things are going under. And that's what happened a little bit in the modernization process, during the modernization process in Romania. Well, I put there one of my references. So there was a counter-reaction which is incremental for the shaping of the political modernity and finally the political democracy in the Romanian state, even in our days. And I think the historical perspective is essential in putting some light upon this process. Okay, maybe we should move to the other. Okay, so for the second part, very briefly, claiming the future through a battle for the past, history weaponized against democracy. Here we have also some fundamentals about how history was in fact treated in the 19th and 20th century and now also, and during the communist regime also in Romania. It was, as we all know, so well, and we lived it, some of us. There is a need, a permanent need of the political totalitarian or authoritarian regimes to shape the form of the past in order to conquer the future and in order to in fact propose an alternative future by inventing, constructing, deconstructing and mythologizing the past at its leisure. And in fact, what I found in my research, because I'm specialized in the political thought of the 19th and early 20th century, especially through the lens of political science and not history, we are in fact in front of a political model who is thriving in our days, also, not only in the past, but also in our present, which is about preaching and not teaching history. And preaching has all the elements of a dangerous religion. I took some photos yesterday while waiting for my flight to finally depart from Bucharest. There were some photos of an exhibition with Dach's portraits, portrete de Dach, Dach's portraits. There's Dachomania thriving in Romania, which is not new, which is in fact an obsession of the historical making of modern Romania, part of it, not all of it, but part of it, an important part of it, during the 19th century, and retrieved and weaponized by the National Communist regime. And now we see it all around the nationalistic propaganda, which is also thriving in political and public life in Romania today. So, preaching and not teaching history, and in a parallel and unfortunate manner, a lack of public policies, real public policies in the realm of education, which I think is incremental for the democratic regimes. And well, we can discuss that also. I won't be able to give you details, but it's an example of how unfortunate is, in fact, the direction towards a good democratic education, which is lacking, and paralleled with the thriving of the nationalistic propaganda by history. Okay, so my last slide, the sovereignty problem, continuity or disruption. here we have a problem which is retrievable, especially in the makings of our post-communist regime and the making of our political framework. We had a regime which was based 1 year after the fall of the communist regime on a constitution which was from the beginning hesitant and very contradictory in its provisions, which led, in fact, to a very annoying problem, which was the lack of coherence and the frailty of some of the core institutions of our democratic model. The result was a hybrid regime which was abused several times in our post-communist period of 30 years and so, and which led to a democratic backsliding. So the Romanian hybrid regime design responded, in fact, to several residual tendencies also. It was not also only the victim of the present, but also the victim of a past which came alongside the present. It fitted quite well with the institutional political power structure inherited from the communist regime. So it was, in fact, I'm asking myself, sovereignty as a form of continuity, a form of disruption. There is something in between. A second point, it satisfied the need for democratic representation from the civil society, even though the quality of the representation and the electoral means of achieving it were at least questionable. So there was, in fact, a disruption within the electoral system, and it still is, in fact. And third point, it was a good start for putting in place an elite system, largely in debt, symbolically and financially and economically and politically, with the ex-communist nomenclatura. So here you have the continuity in all its beauty. And just to finish, today that lack of coherence and that inheritance of the communist structure is also, in fact, combined with the post-pandemic illnesses. I was just thinking about it when you gave your talk. In fact, the emergency state, the necessity state, which in fact left, even though we don't have it anymore formally, left some restrictions and some democratic failures in place. And we can, of course, talk about it also during the talks. So, just to conclude, the failure of liberalism is not only, in fact, or the democratic liberalism is not just is not a failure, but it's an illness and it's frailty and it's just complacency. And in fact, what I think we need to do is just realize the fact that democracy is not a given thing. It's a thing that needs maintenance and caretaking and a lot of effort and education. Please, please take this with all the caveats of lacking time, and thank you so much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for a very interesting paper, which brings to mind, I think we've had Italians mentioned a few times today, so it feels important to stay on an Italian theme. So I think your paper brought to mind a rather lovely scene in the novel Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, in which a very elderly Italian talks to a very young American GI. And the young American GI is eager, full of the future, full of America, and full of himself. And he says, America's going to last forever. And the Italian looks at him, slightly disturbed, and says, forever? He says, how long is forever? And there's a little discussion on that. And the Italian says, let me tell you a story. He says, when Italy was a monarchy, I was a monarchist. When Italy was a democracy, I was a Democrat. When Mussolini came, I was a fascist. When the Nazis came, I was obedient. When the Americans came, I was vividly happy to be pro-American Democrat. And when you leave, I'll still be Italian. So I think there's something here which is kind of interesting, but a point you make which is important and substantive, which is that actually we have perhaps got into that habit, again from the optimism of the late 1990s, to assume that democracy was a permanent feature of our present and our future, and actually it may not be. And I was struck too, just thinking about actually a great Polish writer, Leszek Kolakowski, who, when he was awarded the Kluge Prize in, I think, 2003 in Washington, D.C., wrote a wonderful essay, which I commend to you if you haven't read it, his acceptance speech, which is on something like, is on the importance of history, effectively. And Kolakowski said, well, actually, there's something so important here to have some common framework of respect for facts, respect for the past. And that's actually the fundamental foundation on which free societies are built. And I'm paraphrasing him, but he expresses it much more beautifully than I have, much more correctly. But I think we're living in an age when actually, if you like, the romanticism, not the academic perspective on this, predominates. And that's part of a challenge, I think, that's come from all three of the papers that we've heard today. And there's a British novelist, Jeanette Winterson, who in one of her novels in the 1990s had a rather lovely turn of phrase for this. It's one of her characters, obviously not her. She's saying, and I quote, history should be a hammock for swinging and a game for playing. The way cats play. Claw it, chew it, rearrange it, and at bedtime it's still a ball of string full of knots. Nobody should mind. Some people make a lot of money out of it. Publishers do well. Children, when bright, can come top. It's an all-purpose rainy day pursuit, this reducing of stories to history. And I think there's an interesting challenge at the moment, that if you like, the debate about history, including the politicized debate about history in curricula, which is not exclusive, I would say, to Central and Eastern Europe. It's been a vivid debate in countries like my own, in the UK and the United States as well, but reflects some of those concerns. So look, three very interesting papers. If I may, I'm going to abuse my role of controlling a microphone, the most important piece of exceptional sovereignty on this table. And I'm going to ask probably three questions, if I may, to the panel before opening it up. And the first really is around sovereignty. Because I think Nikolai challenged us this morning, I think rightly, to say, how can we find new forms of language, new forms of connection to reanimate democracy for the next generation? And one form of language, both in the academic debate and particularly in the applied world of politics, but sovereignty really has been a discussion that has been owned, as it were, by authoritarians, or owned by lawyers. And I say that with no disrespect to lawyers, including any in the room. But is there something here where, have we surrendered, and I'd be interested in the panel's view, have we in a sense surrendered sovereignty and debates about sovereignty to authoritarians without, if you like, finding a way of formulating a version and a vision of sovereignty that is pluralist, that is respectful of democratic norms, and that actually provides a counter-narrative to some of the illiberal narratives we hear from Putin and others? And I'd be interested in views. Perhaps Professor Tacik, your view first.
Thank Thank you very much. That's a very crucial question, I would say. My ideas here would be a little bit counterintuitive. I do not believe that sovereignty as such, as a concept, can be well squared with pluralism. I believe that sovereignty can be sidelined, sovereignty can be to a certain degree ignored, state sovereignty, and pluralism can be built on top of it, rather than merging one with another. Because if we look at what modern sovereignty is, it has this, especially in the Western world, it has this idea of what Jacques Lacan would call treuner, this singular point in which political power is concentrated. And this is the imaginary of sovereignty. That's why it always sides better with authoritarianism. Because if you want to invoke the concentration of power, then sovereignty is a perfect key to your discourse. Then, what do you do in liberal democracy? Well, in modernity we live in a paradoxical world in which liberal democracy is trying to be squared with state sovereignty. And there's a number of concepts that act as a glue between one and another, such as self-determination or popular sovereignty, through which we are trying to achieve a kind of a unity between state sovereignty as an instrument, as a totality of apparatuses of power, which is still somehow linked to the people. But all these concepts form a very volatile construction. And I believe that if pluralism is to be sought, it is not entirely in the concept of sovereignty itself, but it's rather in all these empty spaces between sovereignty, self-determination, popular sovereignty, and democracy. So invoking sovereignty often, I would be tempted to say by necessity, but maybe that's too far-fetched. But it often triggers the discourse of unity, of oneness, of a central focal point of power. And of course, in liberal democracy, it's much easier to stay away from this concept and try not to evoke it, try to find some means of pluralism beyond it. Still, sovereignty is at play. To give you one example, the control of borders. I mean, the most liberal democratic countries in the world have one point in which the happy discourse about pluralism somehow evaporates. The control of borders, the control of the influx of immigration, the influx of refugees. This is seen as something that is taken for granted, as you just defend yourself. And whenever there is a yourself, there is sovereignty already at play.
Thank you very much, and also thank you, Przemysław, for your more philosophical introduction or this input. I'll go for European practices. So we have this discussion within the EU about sovereignty and autonomy, where to go, how to manage these member states' willingness to keep, not only to maintain, but to keep the sovereignty, which is, so we had this concept of shared sovereignty, very much criticized. And recently we had a discussion that was evoked by this conference on future of Europe, and the major issue was, one of the major conclusions put it forward mainly by the French presidency was, in order to make Europe more efficient in the global scene, we need to have more qualified majority voting, which is, of course, quite contradictory to the concept of sovereignty. So I already some years ago noticed that in the narrative about how to move forward with the integration, the term sovereignty has been has been substituted with term autonomy. But what does it mean? What means autonomy? If sovereignty is about exclusive power or having an exclusive power, being able to enjoying the exclusive power, then it's very much it's a problem for efficient management or governance. So, and I would say also one thing that when you've been speaking and sharing your reflections, it is possible as long as we have a time, let's say this, we had in the European Union this open method of coordination, very popular, especially implemented in the areas of public policies. But for that, you need to have a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of like mutual respect that is not endangered by any threats that are coming from limited resources or the external threats. But in the times when we, on a daily basis, witness or even experience these threats, then we don't have a time. So we maybe need more exclusive power, and it's, yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. There is so much to be said about sovereignty and the ways of making sovereignty compatible with democracy. And I would say that there are maybe two different points of view in tackling this your question. The first take is the historical take, which my colleague already announced. And the second one is the contemporary take, especially in the digital era, and the big question of making democracy as sovereignty compatible in this digital social media environment. So the first one, the historical take, I will just add that in fact, if we are looking into the making of the concept of sovereignty, we are discovering, and we all know, in fact, that it was linked to the absolutism and with the obsession of unity of the state. In the end of at the end of the 16th century, to put an end to religious wars, the concept of sovereignty was the solution in putting the powers together again and disciplinizing the society and empowering the kings and the states and the monarchs in getting things together again. So if we are thinking about Jean Baudin, we are just realizing that we are in plain absolutism. And with Thomas Hobbes, we are not so much further either. So the idea of putting together sovereignty and representation and separation of powers and balancing of powers was in fact a late idea. It was at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. You have Montesquieu, who is trying, Lord Bolingbroke before him a little bit, and of course John Locke, but there are some, in fact, very hard efforts to make things compatible, and we are still trying to do so. And that brings me to my second take, which is the digital take, the contemporary take, and we had the same conundrum in nowadays, because in fact the state will always, in the Foucauldian sense of the way, of the theory, the state will always try to control things and to put things together again, powers, executive, legislative. And the pandemic taught us that we have to be careful about the ways in which the state is intervening in the separation of powers, even in democracies. So that natural, so to put it like this, the natural tendency of the state will be to enforce, in fact, the digital take into something that some of the politics today are calling surveillance capitalism. Shoshana Zuboff and the rest. So we have this type of controlling impulses, and not only impulses, on one side, and we have also the opposite tendency, which is revealed by a very, very, in fact, savage social media, who is fighting against this tendency of the state, but in fact, paradoxically speaking, is achieving sometimes the opposite, because anarchy and and the lack of regulations are in fact enforcing the narrative of the state, who is trying to control things. So we are just, in fact, by not regulating the media, I think, not regulating that large sense of the term, of course, we are just empowering the state into its tendencies to control things and to gather things. So that's the problem with sovereignty in our days. Sovereignty is, in fact, claimed by the state. It's also claimed by populists. Again, I am completely agreeing with you. I have some problems with the term populist, who is I don't know, something very vague. In fact, we have to be careful about it. But some nationalist, authoritarian discourses. So, well, that's a problem for putting together and making compatible democracy and sovereignty in our days in terms which are, in fact, respectful both to democracy and to sovereignty.
Thank you very much. I think the reflection here is we all have a TikTok problem. What do I mean by that? It's not necessarily the doom scrolling that we're going to do through this winter, but it's a fact that actually there is, as you say, this cacophony of retail politics and retail opinion. But I think there's just an interesting challenge here, perhaps across the board, for political language, and whether it's on the liberal international order or some of the sort of legal acquis and so on. Have we yet found some of the forms of political language that have currency and connection with individuals, but still, if you like, protect the fundamental tenets of open societies, liberal democracies, individual freedoms? I think it's kind of a continuing challenge. Now, I could of course continue this discussion up on the panel, but I'm looking around the room, and I'm sure people want to ask some questions or give speeches disguised as questions. So I'm going to open it up and see if anybody would like to. I prefer the questions to the speeches, if that's all right. But would anybody like to come in at this stage and ask any questions of the panel? Shyness not required. Yes, please. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. A brilliant comment rather than a question. So let me try not to answer you directly, but follow your reflection. And when you talked, I immediately immediate reflection came to my mind. It's something that was missing in my talk was an observation that today's international but also foreign politics of the states is less about process and is more about actions and reactions. And we see it on the domestic level very much, and it can be really easily detected or studied using this theoretical framework we proposed. But what do we see? We see that the decisions that are implemented are not the result of sometimes, I don't want to say long-lasting process, but a process that engages different actors. So we can see here that the space for debate and exchanging political preferences or meeting political preferences with knowledge that comes from experts, for instance, is shrinking. So what do we have? This is one thing. So we have less process, more deciding. And these decisions, it's also interesting what has changed. Decisions are becoming more reactive or proactive, but without any reference to the other players. So we expected that Russia would not attack because all the analysis, this was impossible, but it happened. And then we have all kinds of reactions, and these reactions very often are not once again consulted or discussed, agreed, and fully and jointly implemented. So I would say that we are moving towards some kind of anarchy instead of having new type of multilateralism. The same is on the energy market. Everyone does what everyone wants, and the preferences regarding the operational strategies are changing every 3 months. So Russia can go with the Saudi Arabia. The liberal democracies like Australia, for instance, United States, or South Korea. South Korea maybe is not a perfect example of liberal democracy, but at least a market-oriented state. They immediately during the COVID, they switch into fossil fuels with any reference to the global environmental agreements, without any reference to the other actors, non-governmental actors' reactions. So this is something, less processes, less connections, less responsibilities, and also less empathy, I would say.
Thank you very much. I would offer a quick aside, which is I do think, having run a UN Security Council expert group and as a former British diplomat, I think there's a particular dimension at the moment because you've got a Security Council member who's involved. And I do think that changes the dynamics for the Security Council, and actually for the Secretary General, it really changes the dynamics as well. And that's not offering any comment or forgiveness about the reach or effect of the UN role in this crisis. But just to riff, I think, off two things that you said, I would very much agree with you that I think there's been a diminishing of the multi-stakeholder space in foreign policy. But I think that's always been much more tentative than people thought. And actually, although states often commit rhetorically to multi-stakeholderism, actually, when you look at the states who really properly do it, their number is few, even amongst the community of liberal democracies. But I was also going to offer, finally, just a bit of a defense of, if you like, multi-track processes. So let me give an example. I was leading work in the British system on sanctions, cyber sanctions against hostile actors, including Russian actors. This is between 2018 and 2020. And I think there's something there about, most diplomacy is a mix of bilateral and multilateral in exactly the same way that if we try and organize the faculty dinner party at the end of the semester, trying to do that only in committee, we all know is going to be a disaster. So, you need, if you like, the twin track process to guarantee that you can find a restaurant, and far more importantly, that you can guarantee that everybody will turn up on the day. So I think there's a little bit of defense, as it were, for that variance in approach. But I picking on your paper again, I mean, there's something really important here about what you don't want is an abandonment of like-mindedness, an abandonment of a common generalized key about how you're going to approach a problem. And it's where the fraying of that consensus happens that we should be concerned. But look, let's open it up again. I think, did you... Any of the panel members like to respond or reflect on that?
Yes, I completely agree. In fact, there is a very important danger in falling into the extreme right trap, and that's why we have to be very open to defining and redefining the concept within this new framework and also I think in tackling the problem of the democratic deficit also, because we have a problem in defining sovereignty within the international framework, but we have also a problem in defining sovereignty towards the democratic deficit in itself, rethinking the participation, rethinking the ways in which the citizens are involved in practicing politics, not only just in the electoral process, but outside it. And that's why I think sovereignty should be also rebalanced in the framework of participative democracy in some way, taking into account the fact that paradoxically, the far right, the extreme right, is thriving upon this discontent, this popular discontent, which is in fact issued by the sentiment that citizens are not voiced anymore in the political systems. So there is always two ends to a thread, to a cat's thread. Well, that's just. I completely agree with you that there is something to be thought upon, and of course, sovereignty is not a frozen concept. Democracy is not a frozen concept, also, and in fact, the main political concepts are not or should not be frozen concepts. Otherwise, we are staring at them as in a museum of wax museum. So it's not the goal that we are establishing for us. Thank you.
Yeah, I would add to this picture that sometimes this kind of binding between sovereignty and liberal democracy and pluralism is making democracy a little bit unwieldy. That's what's been happening recently in Chile. I don't know if you've followed what has been going on there, but we had an example of a constitution, of a draft constitution that has been elaborated in a thoroughly democratic process and a lot of consultations with an attempt to encompass all kinds of diversity, including gender diversity, including indigenous peoples, different minorities within the country, as a result of which the drafters produced a very long and not particularly convincing text, which was rejected yesterday in referendum. So you might think, okay, this is what Bruce Ackerman called a constitutional moment, the moment when the sovereign, the people, define themselves. And suddenly we see that pluralism of the society cannot be encompassed within precisely this sovereignist moment, that the society is too pluralist to form like one constitutional text. And the more you include this pluralism, you only aggravate the problem, which is extremely paradoxical because, you know, this is what I believe Democrats from around the world could celebrate this Chilean draft. And suddenly it's been a sort of a calamity that, you know, it's a little bit hard to explain why it happened like this.
Thanks very much. I can open up again for next, please, come on.
Yeah, so Brexit can be categorized as a manifestation of first renationalization and then resistance. But we conceptualize this framework to analyze dynamics of changes of member states' commitments or engagement in common foreign and security policy. So UK wouldn't be the best example, because our two case studies, Hungary and Poland, done in separate papers, and now we want to move forward, and we are working on a paper that will investigate institutional changes which occurred within foreign policy institution on the domestic level. But Poland and Hungary represented both an examples of country which entered the EU in 2004, and their foreign policy was pretty much Europeanized. So it went through the process. They were seen as a good students. If we use this again, another instrument we incorporated into the model, instrument of mechanisms of Europeanization, which is adaptation, adjustment and adaptation. Learning and socialization. And UK is not a good example because we know why, because UK had a special status within the EU, also in the common foreign and security policy. Yes. And referring to the populists, you know, there are a number of the term populism conceptualization. I don't think simply that, especially in case of Poland, engagement of this term into discussion on foreign policy, Europeanization of Europeanization helps too much. It blurs a little bit the picture, because Polish foreign policy is not that, is not under the populists, or it does not represent the populist logic. Just to give you an example of my case, we examined in the paper. The case that we examined was changes in Polish approach to Middle Eastern peace process. Why Middle Eastern peace process? Because Middle Eastern peace process, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, represents for the EU one of the top priority, long-lasting. It represents long-lasting consensus. It has been defined decades ago, and actually until let's say this Visegrad new opening for Israel with Netanyahu hasn't been contested by anyone, and it became contested. So Netanyahu managed to enter the EU through the doors, from the Visegrad doors. But what we found out doing a lot of interviews and through the empirical studies, that Polish approach to this specific issue and some other issues hasn't been a manifestation of populism, because it's not priority for Polish citizens at all. It was rather because of Polish Atlantic orientation and in security policy. So I would say this Atlanticism in Polish foreign policy is again long-lasting, well-established preference that actually reflects that is not changing because of the transition of power, and is not definitely changing because of any ideological reasons. So it's very pragmatic. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Who else would like to come in with a question or a disguised speech? Excellent, in the back.
I think it's also very much relates to what you said about searching for a universal, or at least widely legitimized language we can speak about, or we can elaborate on all those processes that are challenging not only democracy but our civic activities, or our civic or our life simply. And referring to your first point, once again, let me not answer directly, but share with you immediate reflection I had when you were speaking. I immediately thought, what happened in Poland that our let's say, civil society, what changed in Polish civil society, and what made this shift towards the what empowered these illiberal tendencies. I believe, and I'm not an expert, I'm just, this is the reflection of a citizen rather than a scholar. I think that the main issue is that we started to witness growing cleavages, and these were mostly social and economic cleavages. And here the term populist would be helpful probably, because we had the Poland A and B. The distribution of benefits and costs were really problematic. And we really started, especially in the second term of civic platform, Polish society started to Poles started to ask question to what extent the elites do represent their basic interests, like the access to public services, education, healthcare, and so on, and to what extent these leaders. So I think it's a matter of crisis of leadership, and then Poles maybe believed that a change in power, like simply a rotation, can make a change. That's, I don't know, maybe this is the problem. But why people are not again engaged, this is something that we even talked about during our breakfast brief discussion, in reference to Russia rather. And this is something that I may probably would like to study a little bit more. Role of emotions in being in public civic life and in politics as well. I think we are living, many times you also mentioned that, and my co-panelists, a fear, for instance. We have this theory of securitization that explains a lot, but really people who do live in a fear, and they probably they have a little stability, they don't want to risk, and they prefer to be a kind of a bystander or to remain silent. So that's a challenge. I mean, that's a problem. It's also a problem for the participatory democracy. What kinds of you have to first define your agenda and then go for it, and then even fight for it. If you ask me if I have a strength to fight, I don't. I am completely, and I could give you a couple of stages where I could or I should fight. I don't have a strength. And I have, we talked about Russian colleagues or Ukrainian colleagues. So that's maybe a main challenge, that we're somehow, I don't know, maybe it's not being tired, but helpless. And just a question it's a question to colleagues from UK. How come, this is something that is, destroying my thinking over summer. How come Russian oligarchs can be killed in UK even today, even nowadays, and Russians, and nothing happens in Spain? I'm not even saying that this happens in Russia. This is a criminal setup, okay? But this happens also in Europe, and we can't do anything about it. So that's a major issue. So really, this is also an issue of efficient rule of law.
Thanks very much. Obviously, I think going to the presentation earlier, what we don't want necessarily is exceptional legislation every time to deal with it. But let's go on.
Okay, so I would have a comment, even if you were referring especially to Poland, but also to other Central and Eastern European countries. Regarding your question about civil society, or your comment about civil society, Romania had, as we all know, a different experience after the fall of the communist regime. We are often saying that in Romania there wasn't any civil movement under the communist regime, or just elements of it. So we had, after the communist fall, we had to build up a civil society. I have several PhD students who are working on theses regarding the making of the civil society via, especially via social media in the early 2010 and so on. So that's a main issue regarding the democracy in Romania and maybe in Bulgaria also. Regarding your appeal to nuances in defining concept and not being binary about it, of course. And we have the seminal work of Liphard, who is entitled Patterns of Democracy, and there are so many of it. Of course, we have to pay attention within these models. I think there is a major issue that can't be banned. It's about accountability and political accountability. Political accountability comes with the narrative also, not only with the legislative framework, but also with the narrative. And when you have a narrative which is in fact between is opting for one or another forms of non-democratical framework, we have a problem. Timothy Snyder calls these types of narratives politics of inevitability or politics of eternity. And he's defining both in its latest book, The Road to Unfreedom. We are facing a conundrum because we are now witnessing a battle between those two types of narratives. The irresistible democracy is no longer there, of course. That was the politics of inevitability. And we are now facing also the forces of the politics of eternity, which comes from Putin's Russia, which comes from the DAX and the trucks and the obsession of the Trakoman. So we are in fact in the middle of a battle. Sorry for my very cinematic view, but in fact there is a battle of narratives here, and that's why I chose also to cite Latour, because we are witnessing a battle of narratives, and it's confusing, but we have to keep in mind that we have to, I don't know, to make sense of it and to keep our heads clear among this battle of narratives.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one last question from the audience. Does anybody want to? Yes, please, come on in.
Yeah, very good point. It's yes, indeed. But in this first slide, when I put some pictures, one could really have an impression that it's really Eurocentric. But my intention was, I was actually inspired by the title of this panel. So I wanted to first very briefly to portray the bigger picture and to move from the bigger picture up to this regional European dimension, and from the larger European EU picture to move even lower, if I may say so, to the Central Eastern European states. So that was the logic, but you are absolutely right. But as said before, I'm very much interested in energy policy and the politicization of public policies and so on. So what I, for instance, see for this paper I mentioned, we did also a review on the responses of different organizations, regional organizations, African, Asian, and so on COVID. So if they manage to take a stance, if they manage to encourage the states, how efficient they are in terms of communication with the states. So definitely the European Union is the most advanced in terms of ability to penetrate member states' public policies. You know, we speak foreign policy is a different case, but then the very much supranationalized policies, where we have the qualified majority voting, is a different case. And in these different cases, so mostly related to economy, European Union is really, really, you know, we can't compare anything else with the European Union. But there is a huge enthusiasm and movement in Africa, for instance. I would say that the Asian ASEAN, for instance, there is a political dialogue, but the number of shared interests is somehow overshadowed by the number of tensions and dividing interests. So what, of course, influence the multilateralism as such.
Super. So we are, what we are trying to do is, of course, observe the rule of law here. So the rule of law says that we have precisely 2 minutes left of this panel. And I was going to ask if we could close by very briefly asking each of our panelists in one sentence, if that's all right, what your prediction would be for the state of democracy in CEE if we were to meet in 1 year's time after what we know is going to be a difficult winter. So perhaps starting with you, and let's go.
One sentence I can answer in one word: chaos.
No, abstention. No, I agree. Unfortunately, but maybe we should also sometimes offer recommendation. Yeah. So my recommendation would be that. And I said that I don't have a power anymore, and I'm tired. I am, but and then the second thought comes to my mind: if we'll give up, then what? We can't. We have children. So let's really struggle for this rule of law framework, or a structure, or the structure based on the rule of law, because this is the only thing that protects us as individuals and the community.
Well, difficult task to put in one sentence. I don't know. I think it depends on the fate of the conflict, of the war, just on our border here. It depends also on the leadership also. In Europe and all around the globe, in fact. I am not very optimistic, I have to admit it, but we can't, in fact, completely give up. It's a question of political science issue, not being optimistic, and it's a question of citizenship, practical citizenship in not giving up. So I'm both of it.
So thank you very much. Look, my takeaway from this excellent panel, and my thanks to all three panelists, is there's something here about political language. You know, how do we think about re-enchanting people with democracy? and finding new forms of language and engagement, but also old fundamental truths about free societies, open societies, and democratic societies. So please, will you join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent presentations? Thanks.